which was, 1965, 3 days ago, February 21st, 1965. Malcolm X said, revolution is based on land. Land is the basis for all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. Too often, when we think about questions of equality, we're not asking questions that preceded the conversation about equality, which gets at these questions of what do human beings need to live good lives? And in order to live good lives, we have to all organize, defend, and sustain the ecological commons. We have to have air to breathe. We have to have water to drink. We have to have food to eat. We have to have housing to shelter us. And if we're living in a cold climate like Chicago or Minneapolis, we got to have some clothes, particularly on days like today. So we have allowed a world ecology to evolve that makes the cost of our lives go up while making the means of democracy to mutually discuss how we make life work for all of us decrease over time. So we've got democracy going in the wrong direction, ecological integrity going in the wrong direction. And in 2021, we also have more and more people like those of you who are in this space with me today, asking these critical questions of how do we elevate, amplify, and connect all of our organizing to secure a future worth having for future generations.
I'm sorry, Sam, we're just having a little trouble seeing your slides. I'm wondering if you could maybe stop the screen share and restart it, because right now we can just see a frozen Zoom screen.
Okay, I will try and do that. I've got an old computer that it's hard to see where my mouse is. So I'll just do, there we go. Okay, so I took the screen share off and I will now put it back on and we'll see if we have any better luck.
That looks great. That looks excellent.
And now, once I hit play, can you still see it? Can you see it now?
It looks wonderful. Yes, thank you so much.
All right, thanks for letting me know. So what I want to cover today is a little bit of history, offer a little bit of perspective, but I also want it to be, participatory. I want there to be a little bit of back and forth. I want us to have a conversation. And so I'm actually going to start from that place and ask you all to flood the chat with your perspectives on this question. So how do we see the intersections of land, racial, and climate justice? When you think about those three things, to what extent do you feel like people are organizing with an understanding of all those things being related to each other in the way you're doing your organizing? Or are you noticing that in the way people are organizing where you live now, people are thinking about these as separate things and there's no real connection? So just say a little bit about what you see happening in terms of organizing and what you'd like to see happen as you reflect on these intersections. So we'll take just like 3 minutes for you just to sort of flood the chat. And I'll just let folks who are monitoring the chat call out a couple of perspectives as they come in. Because I can't see them since I'm doing my screen share.
What Danielle said, I'm seeing a huge increase in these things coming together and organizing. Which is great. Keep those thoughts coming, y'all.
And I'll add in another layer of question to this to support more flooding of the chat. As you think about the intersectionality of land, racial, and climate justice, what do you recognize as the most critical challenges that we have to be mindful of in order to really organize at the intersection of land, racial, and climate justice? So what do you see as the challenges and obstacles to effective intersectional organizing on these three things?
Mike shared consensus-based land use is key to survival. Katie shared the ability of folks to make a living and a life on land. Keep them coming. These are great. Michelle shared that it seems like pre-COVID orgs were in silos, but that she agrees with Danielle, a lot of mutual aid coming through because of COVID-19 and remembering collaboration and how racial and climate justice are interconnected as we are as beings. Chelsea shared that there is no climate justice without land and racial justice. The further we dive into an ideal of regenerative agriculture or sustainable agriculture that's stripped away from these conversations about land access and race, the further we get away from actual justice.
So thank you all for those comments, and you can keep flooding those comments in as we continue this conversation. But I really appreciate that point made, that the way that a lot of people who are talking about regenerative agriculture and sustainable agriculture are talking about it and operationalizing it, they still are not centering questions of justice for people who have been dispossessed, displaced, excluded, and exploited. And so it's really important to ask ourselves the organizing question. If we are among those people who have been dispossessed and displaced, if not us, who is going to organize this deeper intersectionality? And if not now, when? So if we recognize that we're the ones who have to do this organizing, and we recognize that we have to do this organizing now, and we can't look outside of ourselves and hope that the Biden administration is going to, give us a silver bullet, or that all of the corporations in America are going to wake up tomorrow morning and say, you know what, the hell with industrial agriculture, the hell with predatory lending, the hell with economic injustice. We're going to do the right thing by the land and by the people completely starting today. Hallelujah. We can't count on that. So since we can't count on that, but we can count on ourselves and each other, how do we center a healing justice framework in this work so that we're working at a vibration of healing our relations with the land and each other as we carry this work out? So I'll tell a couple of quick stories before I dive into the rest of the presentation here. So one quick story. In 1985, back when I was, really, really young, I had a graduate fellowship working at a group called the International Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture. And the definition of sustainable agriculture that it worked from was that we have to have an agriculture that is economically sound, ecologically viable, economically viable, ecologically sound, socially just, and humane. That it had to be all four of those things. And what we meant by humane at that time was that we had to think about more than just human beings. We had to think about honoring the integrity of all species in relationship with us on the planet. And yeah, looking back, we probably shouldn't have used the word humane because that anthropocentrizes the rest of nature. So we got to heal that up and evolve. But we started with an understanding that social justice had to be included. But in my experience, looking at the way that sustainable agriculture was practiced, we really were leaving social justice on the edge of the work, and it never really became primary in the work, unless we were just talking to each other within, BIPOC communities. Recently, I got MN 350 to go through a process of coming up with our own definition of regenerative agriculture. And we have our own podcasts. And so I invited colleagues of mine who are, BIPOC farmers to come on to this show and talk about their relationship with regenerative agriculture. And their very quick feedback for me was, Sam, when we think about regenerative agriculture, we think about two things. We think about one, white people who have framed regenerative agriculture in a very narrow way that doesn't center or include racial justice. And two, we also think about it in terms of agriculture as really overly focused on soil health and holistic resource grazing, and not more comprehensively about agriculture the way that agroecology thinks about it. So we have a preference for the framing of La Via Campesina, and really think about a bottom-up, culturally grounded approach to healing our relations with the land and with each other as what we mean by regenerative agriculture. So we're waiting for people who use that language to catch up with us. So I appreciate that comment about regenerative ag and the limitations of the way it's talked about in the mainstream. And so my question for us who aren't part of the mainstream is, how do we interrogate that conversation and flip that conversation to come from a deeper, more intercultural place? So we can talk more about that as we go forward. So now I'm going to dive in and talk about Minnesota and some of our challenges here. So I did a quick little census of farmers in Minnesota, and I found that the state has over 110,000 white farmers, many of them with long-term access to land, whether they are a farmer owner or whether they are renting land, they have long-term deals. And so far, what I'm finding is that for the 1,300 farmers of color, the BIPOC farmers in Minnesota, including the indigenous farmers in Minnesota, the vast majority, unless they're farming on trust land with one of the native nations, are farming on a year-to-year basis with no real sense of a long-term future in that particular parcel of land, which means, how am I going to build soil health? How am I going to build relations with a local market, right? How am I going to pass on what I've created here to future generations? I don't have a stake here that I can trust. How does that impact your body if you're in a situation where you feel and you know the rug could be pulled out from underneath you at any second? So this question of land justice, as I think about agriculture and climate in Minnesota, has become really, really urgent. And I did a good job of not jumping into swear words there because I got some strong feelings about it. So this is the farmer census. Now let's do a land ownership census. The state of Minnesota has more than 51 million acres of land. It also has a lot of millions of acres of water. The state owns about 13 million acres of that land. And then you see on this list, there are 3 major corporations that are among the largest landowners in the state of Minnesota. Now look at what's at the bottom of the list. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which includes 6 native nations in Minnesota, they collectively own less land than Blandin Paper Company, which is the major corporation with the least land ownership on this list here. So there's clearly something amiss with this picture. We're making the argument at MN 350 that as we think about land justice, we think it's important to think about land justice in relationship to treaty rights. We want people to honor and accept a personal, an organizational, and a network obligation to honor and defend treaty rights as part of your day-to-day practice, and not leave it up to the federal government and their trust relationship with Native nations. We're bringing this conversation alive in our Just Transitions organizing work. So in northern Minnesota, we have started a dialogue process that includes the city of Bemidji, Beltrami County, Red Lake Nation, White Earth Nation, and Leech Lake Nation to collaboratively frame a vision of 2050 and ask themselves a series of questions. What would make the future of the region get worse from our different perspectives? What would make the vision of the experience of the future stay the same 30 years from now if nothing substantial changes? What would happen if we use market-based and technology-based incentives to slightly improve, our transition into a renewable energy economy without centering justice? And the fourth vision that we're really asking people to embody is, if we honor treaty rights as rights that we all accept as fundamentally necessary to honor and obligate ourselves to, and all people of all cultures work in partnership with Native nations to honor the integrity of our ecological systems, the integrity of our cultural systems, and the integrity of our democratic and economic systems, to work together in partnership, then what's possible in the region? And what we're finding, not a surprise probably to any of you on the call, is that the folks in white bodies who are in this dialogue are saying, this is the first time I've really thought about Native people and Native nations and treaty rights, because I work with the city, or I work with the county, or I work for a private corporation, and that doesn't enter into our consciousness or into our planning or into our economic forecasting at all yet. So this is new for me. I am new here, but I'm glad to be here and begin this journey. So we're starting from a place of newness. And one of the questions that comes up right away from one of the people in the Native body is, have you all begun to do some work on the internalization of whiteness? Have you worked on the pattern of white savior complex? Have you worked on the pattern of white fragility? Have you worked on the pattern of white resistance to honor relationship? And if you haven't yet begun working on those three levels, it will be difficult for us to have the kind of partnership that we feel like we need to have. Are you open here? And the answer that folks are getting is mixed. Some folks are more open than others, which is not a surprise. We had 4 years of very significant division, exacerbated by number 45. In northern Minnesota, a lot of the folks in Native bodies call Minnesota the Deep North, because for them, it feels like the kind of conditions we had in the Deep South in the 1960s, and in some way, conditions we still have in pockets of the Deep South. So the racial hostility is real in 2021. It's not in the past, it's right here, and it's intense. So as we think about land justice, we have to think through the reality that the Farm Service Administration thinks differently about loan deals to a BIPOC farmer. If a BIPOC farmer is able to get past that gate and is able to secure a land deal, are they going to greet any hospitality from the farmers in the vicinity, or are they going to be under attack? We've had a lot of BIPOC farmers tell us, I want to get on the land and I want to grow food at a bigger scale than I've been able to so far, but I'm not willing to move more than 70 miles from the city because I still need to be able to get to the city so I have a sense of sanity and safety. And that's also where my market's going to be. I'm not trusting that anybody's going to buy my stuff out here in a rural marketplace when I'm the only one that looks like me. So in 2021, we're still having the conversation that we really hoped we would have processed through to some level of completion in the 1960s. So now let's talk about land ownership. Of all private United States agricultural land, whites still account for 96% of the owners, own 97% of the value, and have 98% of the acres. The 5 largest white landowners in the United States own more land than all Black people in the country combined. So 5 people versus millions. You're going to laugh, you're going to cry, you're going to throw some stuff. However you choose to have an emotional response, we have to take that emotional response and think about it from a transformative vantage point. I hope all of us here in this conversation recognize this is an unacceptable picture in the 21st century. And if it's unacceptable, we have to diagnose everything that is organized in our current system that allows this pattern to persist and what we can do to begin to break this pattern. So let's go back in history a little bit. At our peak in 1910, African American farmers made up 14% of all farmers and had up to 19 million acres of land. By 2012, we were only 1.6% of all farmers and had only 3.6 million acres of land. And another study demonstrated that there was a 98% decline in Black farmers between 1920 and 1997. And this contrasts sharply with an increase in acres owned by white farmers over the same period. Now, I'm glad to report that there has been a resurgence in, Black agriculture, in Latinx agriculture, in, Asian agriculture, in indigenous agriculture in the United States over different kind of time horizons, but really starting in the late 1980s forward, there's been a significant amount of organizing to get ourselves back on the land and into relationship. It's tended to be at pretty small scale, but there's a growing density and a growing dialogue among people in BIPOC bodies that are getting back on the land and really bringing forward some innovations that are exciting. Now, I think it's important to take the questions of land justice and connect it to considerations of wealth. Between 1983 and 2013, median Black household wealth decreased by 75%, while white median household wealth increased by 14%. So look at the disparity in those numbers, 116,000 of median white household wealth versus 1,700 of Black household wealth. And you think about how the Great Recession, as some people call it, in 2008, 2009 exacerbated this because Black folks lost a lot of wealth that they had amassed in that time space. Where I'm organizing and living in Minneapolis, that Great Recession caused a reversal of the pattern of Black homeownership. We had a significant pattern of increasing numbers of Black folks who were owning their own homes up to between like 1995 and 2007. We had a lot of people lose their homes in the Great Recession in the Black community. And so we saw communities that were starting to get close to the tipping point of half the community being renters, half the community being owners. Now the vast majority are renters again. Where I'm living and organizing, more than 77% of white folks own their homes. Less than 25% of African American folks own their own homes. So there's a parallel between the gap in home ownership and the gap in land ownership. But the gap in land ownership is significantly greater consistently over the generations than the gap in home ownership. So as we think about the future, it's really important as we think about the role that agriculture can play in healing our bodies and healing our communities. How can our approach also be about healing our relations with each other economically and creating pathways so that there's a future to pass on to future generations? So these are some of the questions that I think it's important to grapple with. So as we think about all of these questions and challenges in Minnesota, what are we doing? So we began doing a BIPOC farmer census, just talking to BIPOC farmers and working with others that are talking to BIPOC farmers. So we have a group called the Midwest Farmers of Color. It's working across the Midwest, but we have quite a few pretty amazing people in Black and Brown and Indigenous and Asian bodies that are organizing together, here in the local region. And now we have young people working with them who are starting to interview as many of these 1,300 BIPOC farmers as we can find. We have begun bringing those BIPOC farmers together into what we call animation sessions. And what we mean by animation is just to turn on a conversation that comes from our dreaming place of what are the future we're hoping for on the land? What are the things that get in the way of that? So bringing critical consciousness to this question. And what are the possibilities of organizing together in a way that supports us getting farmers onto the land to sequester as much carbon as possible, and document how we're doing that as part of our growing practices. Bring back as much biodiversity as possible through our production processes, and document how we're doing that. Commit and support our farmers to nourishing local living economies, not extractivism, and document how we're doing that. And then finally, organize our farmers to partner with each other so that over time, we have a sense that our farmers are building collective power and are displacing the space available for industrial agriculture's toxicity on the land and on our lives. While doing all of that, we're also beginning to have conversations with mainstream farmers, conventional farmers, including farmers doing corn and soybean rotations. And we're talking to those farmers about moving towards continuous living cover. And we're using this mantra created by one of the organizations in our partnership of Green Land, Blue Waters, meaning that if you're growing food, you should be thinking about water quality and the integrity of the watershed you're growing food in as primary in your production practices. So we're saying, regardless of how you grow food, think about the water quality, think about soil health, think about a permanent root structure in the land so that farms of all scales and cosmologies are at least contributing something towards carbon sequestration. Moving on from the animation sessions, which in part we did to lay out a hope horizon for BIPOC farmers, that the experience you've had up to today is not the experience that we're expecting or allowing to continue. We're activating and raising resources for strategies that are going to support you all individually and collectively in getting on the land sustainably over many generations. And so I'll come back towards the end and tell some stories about what's coming through those animation sessions. But one thing we've learned is that no one model works for everybody. So we have been compelled through the dialogues to upgrade our sensibilities of how we approach this. One size does not fit all. We can't use one approach. Knowing that, we've had to also think about raising money and different partnerships for the different approaches we have to sort of bring online. And that as we do this work, we have to constantly be healing and then growing and organizing infrastructures that support us to stay in cultural, intercultural, and democratic healing relationships. Cultural, intercultural, and democratic healing relationships. And we recognize that we're working in a complex political, ecological landscape. The Biden administration has just brought in Vilsack to be the new Commissioner of Agriculture. He was, the Commissioner of Agriculture under the Obama administration. So now he's coming back, and his cosmology is very much in support of industrial agriculture. And he's seeing what a lot of people around the world talk about climate smart agriculture, which actually allows industrial ag to sustain its power and positionality over the land and over our lives. So I'm coming at this from a very different orientation than that. I want a world of small scale farmers that are linked to local living economies and to each other, and are making commitments to those objectives I talked about earlier, which means they're sequestering carbon, They're bringing back biodiversity. They're contributing to local living economies, not extractivism. And they're cooperating and organizing with each other to grow the space for small scale democratic living economies and reducing the space for colonialism and imperialism here in the United States, but also everywhere else on the planet. So while we have this kind of big tent industrial frame run through the USDA, we also have a lot of folks within the legislature who are pushing for some pretty exciting, legislation. So Cory Booker and a few other folks came together and authored the Justice for Black Farmers Act, which would radically increase the amount of money available for Black farmers to grow food in the United States. So we would surpass the amount of land that we had available in 1910. That would be exciting. That's a significant form of land reparations if we can find a way to actually organize that. I'm not sure what the chances of that are in the current, kind of political climate of red versus blue. But let's go for it, right? So we didn't get the 40 acres and a mule we were promised as part of radical reconstruction. But now in the 21st century, I think it's time to ask ourselves whether or not we are ready and willing to be the source and the engine of a deeper democracy that delivers these things that government and corporations and civil society could not do from the founding of this country up to the present moment. The future is in our hands. How are we going to work with each other? So Georgia, just as one amazing example, one of the states that's been very red for a long time, turned around and became a little bit blue. And one of the early things that Senator Warnock did coming in is to introduce this $5 billion Emergency Relief for Farmers of Color Act as part of the COVID relief stimulus package, which would provide immediate financial relief to Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic farmers. So there's exciting stuff to track and support in the federal legislature. I want you all to also think about what's happening in the Illinois legislature and the Chicago, city council, and fight for changes at municipal scale, at county scale, at state scale, at Midwest scale, at national scale, and at global scale. And I think it's organizing with an understanding of the reality that the well-being of the people in the land here is related to the well-being of the people in the land everywhere else on Mother Earth. So we have to stop being narrow in our sensibilities of what we're fighting for and really begin to breathe some energy into deeply democratic relationship across our geographies. So in our organizing in Minnesota, I laid out my vision for what I call the Agroecology Carbon Trust, which had those objectives I mentioned of carbon sequestration, biodiversity, local living economies, and then farmers organizing in partnership with other farmers through cooperative formations. And I found that good friends of mine had already started organizing this complex relationship between a statewide C2 organization, which is a land holding entity, and a national 501c3 called the Agrarian Trust, which is able to raise significant forms of capital to then invest in those local commons that are organized on a regional basis. And so the Agrarian Trust is now working in 10 states across the country. And Minnesota has the blessing of being one of those 10 states. So we have organized our first board, which we started in October. And then we built that board to do a series of animation sessions with a lot of BIPOC farmers to begin to understand, how do we organize? When I met with the farmers from a Kenyan Farmers Association called Kilimo, and Kilimo is a word in Swahili for farmer, those farmers were overjoyed by the commons model we had laid out for For them, this was perfect because it was the approach to getting onto the land and growing food they had grown up with for generations, going back to, many hundreds of years ago. So this is what they know. They never thought that migrating to the United States, they would have an opportunity for a culturally alive approach to land access that actually made sense to them. So they're crying in the meeting saying, we're ready to go, let's get some land. So we're working with two different groups of Kenyan farmers, groups of about 8 to 10, to find a land deal and get them onto the land with housing to grow food cooperatively in 2021 and 2022. Now, we also have a lot of African American and Latinx and Hmong farmers in our region who are looking at this model and saying, we actually are feeling starved by the way that the nexus of capitalism and racism has prevented us from ever building wealth. And what we actually want is to not have our land in the commons. We want our land in land trusts that we own and control on a cultural basis. So does your agrarian commons model allow for that? And we had to kind of go back and forth of whether or not the agrarian commons model as it was defined so far allowed for that. And we came to the conclusion that no, it does not. So we animated all these folks, and now we have a tension point. The model we've created doesn't fit everybody. So now we're innovating and saying, well, the point is the well-being of people on the land. So we have to upgrade our thinking and define models that actually work for the diversity of people who are trying to find a way to get onto the land. So we're moving from one size fits all to multiple approaches. And we're actually now raising money and have talked to the first 3 funders to create a Commons Innovation Fund that will allow us to be more nuanced in the way we help farmers get onto the land. So that will include organizing land trusts, organizing small-scale economic cooperatives, organizing Black commons, the way that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about it in 1907 in his important work on, Black economic cooperation. And we're also realizing that some farmers just want to copy the Joneses. They just want a piece of land they completely own. And some farmers are figuring out how to do that. But the vast majority of farmers we're talking to, they are not in a position because they don't have the equity or they don't have the credit score to get in on the land deals in rural Minnesota that way. So they're having to take cooperative approaches. And then we're also saying, because of the long-standing oppression and lack of access to too many of our people to ever get on the land, we actually have to continue to fight for climate reparations. And part of that climate reparations is to fight for land reparations. So I'll move on. So this idea of the Black Commons, if you haven't looked at it yet, if you Google what's underlined here, in 1907, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote this piece, Economic Cooperation Among Negro Americans. Go and take a look at it. In 1907, he came to the conclusion after looking at how the American economy works. And he said the American economy is a racialized economy. It doesn't look like it's pragmatic for us to believe it's ever going to include us on equitable terms. So instead of trying to fight for equity with the Joneses, we probably ought to think about a culturally grounded conversation about the future we want to create for ourselves and having that freedom of self-determination on a cultural basis anchored in our relations with each other. Then from that vantage point to have a conversation about the democracy we want to grow with people in other cultural formations. W.E.B. Du Bois' dream was not fully listened to. It also wasn't fully articulated. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, as one of the great Black cooperative theorists, scholars, and activists, has taken the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and sort of upgraded our thinking about it for the 21st century. So we're recognizing that in order for economic cooperation to work, we have to look at it in a complex way. We have to organize consumers into cooperative associations, organize producers into cooperative associations, organize both consumers and producers into cooperative finance associations, such as through community development credit unions, and then also organize culturally grounded vehicles for democratic decision-making through a cultural commons that also allows us to organize the infrastructure for a basic needs commons, which means if you're here in our space, we're going to make sure that your basic needs are met, because we believe that unless you're thriving, we're not thriving. So beginning to create small scale, semi-autonomous spaces where we grow the energy of freedom with each other and then share it as broadly as we can with other people around the planet. So that's the discourse around the Black Commons. It's not new. This is an old idea. In fact, if you go back to ancient thought in Egypt and the four principal siblings who created the cosmology and the value system of Ma'at, there was a thinking of living in balance and living in harmony that was organized into community associations on the ground all over East Africa. More than 50 years ago, Fannie Lou Hamer, when she created the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, also brought alive through something she created called Freedom Farms, a framework which, without knowing this ancient African history, actually honored much of it in the way that she organized people to practice economic cooperation with each other. So models at small scale of us coming together, loving the land and loving each other in a really good way, they're plentiful. Are we connected to those models? Are we a catalyst for those models? Are we in democratic dialogue about how we grow the space for those models? These are some of the questions to think about. Now, to get close to coming back into democratic dialogue with you all, I want to sort of frame what I'm calling the tortuous and joyful journey of my own work in this. So as I indicated before, I've been doing work on this for a while, since 1985. But the agroecology carbon trust is an idea I just framed in March of 2020. So it's not even a full year old. I found out in June about other folks building this agrarian commons. So I agreed to come on to their board of directors, and have since, coming on their board of directors, also brought on 2 more people onto the board of directors, an African American and the founder and leader of Kilimo, the Kenyan Farmers Association. And then had dialogues between the agrarian commons and another group that owns a significant amount of land in the Midwest called the Climate Land Leaders. One of those climate land leaders, which are largely a composition of older white women that have family passed down to them from generations of farmers, but now they're at a point where the next generation does not want to farm. And so their questions are, am I going to donate the land to something like the agrarian commons? Am I going to keep the land and speculate on it and make some money for me? Or am I going to do something in partnership with the BIPOC community that's growing in Minnesota and find a way to be a relevant resource to share my privilege in a way that nourishes a different, more intercultural and ecological future for farming in the region? So one quick story. One of the climate land leaders said, I'd love to figure out a way to support one of the emerging BIPOC farmers. So we connected her to the founder of the Somali American Farmers Association, who is, as we speak, working to close a deal on a 110-acre farm in northern Minnesota. So these two are meeting with each other and going back and forth on the business model for this 110-acre farm, so that this climate land leader can take $50,000 of the money that she has, that she's choosing to gift to a BIPOC formation to support the future of BIPOC-led agriculture in Minnesota. So this is an exciting example that we're trying to nourish and nudge, and we're hoping there will be a whole lot more of that. We're continuing to do animation sessions, but instead of me doing the animation sessions. We're now raising money to pay the farmers in the BIPOC communities to facilitate these animation sessions directly with the folks who trust them and are following their leadership, out in the field. And we think this is going to, go as far as we can go in terms of taking an organized base and finding land that fits with that organized base. And we're finding that equation between farmers being ready and land being ready not being as easy as we would like it to be. So every county has different policies about how many parcels of housing you can put up on a piece of land. So in some counties in Minnesota, you can have 2 housing units per acre. In some, you can only have one unit of housing for every 40 acres. And our farmers are thinking cooperatively, and they want 3 or 4 or more households to be together on the land. So some of the areas where we're finding the ideal land isn't land that allows the farmers to have multiple units of housing. So if the land is right for the farmers, but the housing situation is not, then we're having to take a step back and say, well, somewhere is there land that allows a higher density of housing near this farm so that the farmers can actually cut down their travel miles to grow food productively here on this landscape? Because we're trying to figure that out. And one more reason that we feel like we have to figure that out is a lot of our farmers are talking about a practical fear about the racial hostility in rural Minnesota. If they move onto the land and they don't have cultural support, they'll be under attack. And I wish I could say that's just a feeling that doesn't match reality, but it is an actual reality. So we're continuing to do animation sessions. We're looking for land deals. We're recognizing that our limitations are there, and we're trying to get more and more clear about those limitations. And then let the limitations be a guide for the next innovation and continue to explore innovations. So as an example of this, recognizing limitations, we're about to do an animation session in March and bring together folks from the National Agrarian Trust with the board of the Agrarian Commons and with some of the farmers we've been in dialogue with to do a mutual kind of design hack, looking at different scenarios of supporting farmers and getting onto the land, and then think through how does our approach to finance, how does our approach to market, how does our approach to cultural support, how does our approach to reducing hostility sectors, how does all of that shift based on these different kind of scenarios? So we got a lot of work ahead of us, but it's exciting work. And finally, the thing I'll say is that given my commitment to climate justice in Minnesota, we're actively thinking through how can agriculture in each of the regions of Minnesota be understood as a critical contributor towards climate justice objectives in Minnesota. So when people talk about climate change, they're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% or more by 2030 and getting us to zero carbon by 2050. But as we talk about it in our BIPOC formations, what we're talking about is reimagining the approach to climate change as a climate justice approach, which heals the 600-year legacy of colonialism, patriarchy, and racism, and economic injustice. And in order for the next 30 years to set us in new democratic intercultural relations with each other, we're looking at how do we organize in all of our partnerships, both an ethos and an infrastructure that supports that journey. You all have heard the notion of building a plane while flying it. We're very much doing that in our day-to-day work at MN350. So now I want to come back into the conversation with you all and just, see if you have any questions for me on what I've shared, or just have you all give me some insight or give each other collective insights on this question of how do we organize to realize the highest possible intersectionality of land, racial, and climate justice in our local area, whether you're in Chicago or, here in Minnesota with me or anywhere else on the planet. How do we organize for that future? I'm going to stop my share and come back into the comments with you all now. Thank you all for listening. Let's talk to each other.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was really comprehensive, very engaging presentation. I'm just so grateful for your time sharing the story, the ongoing story about what's going on in Minnesota with this Chicago-based audience. And there was a lot of further thoughts and discussion from the first question prompt that are in the chat. I'm also thinking that if folks click on reactions, they can raise their hand, and they can, instead of me, reading out what they've said, maybe folks can share directly some of their thoughts and engage directly in the conversation. We have about 57 participants in the Zoom chat right now. So just to make sure that we're not all talking at once, I would encourage folks to raise their hand with the Zoom reaction, and we can and also, if you aren't comfortable, you can continue to use the written chat function too.
And I see a great question in the chat from Liz Henderson. So since I'm seeing that one, and I apologize, I'm sure there's others before Liz's, but it's the first one I'm noticing. So I'm just gonna, sort of call that one in. So thanks, Liz, for this really super important question. So for those of you who are not looking at the chat, the question is, what do you say to Chris Newman's critique that land trusts may include Black farmers in accessing land now, but when these farmers die, this land could revert to white control? This goes back to the question of really understanding what these models offer and what the limitations of these models are. Because of our hunger to solve a short-term need, we often don't take the time to think through the complexity of the limitations of any model we look at. Every model is limited. Every model is limited. We have to use democracy and innovation and cultural and intercultural insight to work at the edges of where models have limits that are not acceptable to us, and nudge those models to be more resonant with our longer term vision of what we think is necessary for the integrity of our families, the integrity of our cultures, the integrity of our communities. So if a Black land trust forms, or if Black folks join a land trust, you can put into the land lease a protection that you can pass on your ownership right to a next generation. So as we're thinking about it in our agrarian commons, one farmer has a lease of 25 years, because given the corporate land law in Minnesota, corporate farm law in Minnesota, there's a limit. I remember it's 25 years or 29 years, but it's a much more narrow limit than other states, which allow 50 years or 99 years. So at the end of 25 years or 29 years, we then have to go back and renew the lease. But we're writing in, if anything happens during any particular lease cycle to a current owner, if the owner has other people who want to continue the objectives of the agrarian commons, the owner has the freedom to do that. So we're inviting people primarily to come onto the land in collective formations. So if anybody gets sick or anybody has an elder, somewhere else on the planet that they need to go care for, there's plenty of people who are in the system who will sustain the system and keep it going. So my response to your really important question, Liz, is to design it into the land lease and make it part of the democratic dialogue at the beginning, because good design is an antidote to hidden problems later on. So we have to reveal our blind spots about this stuff based on a clear assessment of the limits of these models over history. And just as another example to sort of put a point of emphasis on what Liz is saying here, many people have looked at the work of the agrarian trust and these commons-based models that we're creating, and they have said, you know what? There's something that still feels really colonial about this model. And so some of the African-American farmers that I've talked to in particular have said, Sam, what you're saying is really exciting to us, but we don't want to have to negotiate or navigate how we get on the land or stay on the land with white people having any decisional power over us. We want the decisional power collectively on a cultural basis within the African-American community. Do you see a way that we can do that? And my answer is absolutely. It just means that we have to bake this particular strategy in the oven, and we have to raise the money for this particular strategy, because the agrarian commons is a model that is grounded in a broader kind of framework, and it doesn't, on its surface, make this easy, but it does allow a caveat where people in a particular region of Minnesota, because we're saying each commons will have 10 to 11 farmers in it. If 10 or 11 Black farmers come together and say, we want to do a commons in this part of Minnesota, our model does allow for those farmers to create that with each other and hold that land together. So design and flexibility are critical variables. And I want to allow some time for other questions. So Liz, I'm going to stop there and say thank you for your brilliant question. And I look forward to more dialogue with you on it. Now I want to ask my good friend, Karen Lehman, who's one of the most brilliant people in food systems work in the United States that I've ever met, to come off mute and just ask her question out loud. Karen, good to see you.
Sam, it's so great to see you. Yeah, okay, so thank you for that, but back at you right there. We've known each other a long time. So this is a question about a land bank idea. To create a structure that has multiple kinds of parties, like a township, a nonprofit, maybe a land farmer or landowner association as partners in it, where it's not actually a commons as you're describing it, but it is a structure to hold land, have land be able to move in and out of private ownership because of that wealth building piece that you talk about. Yep. And let me just say, this is nothing more right now. I mean, it's a vision. There's no structure in place right now. So, I mean, it's at a really formative point where a conversation with you and your group could be really valuable in sharing and learning from each other.
I appreciate that you guys are thinking about that there, and we are on a parallel path. So we're talking about a hybrid model. So just as an example, there is one young Black farmer who is mixed heritage, and she has an aunt in her family system who is white, who no longer has the capacity to continue the operation. So she's committed to sell the operation outright, to this next generation. And in order to do it, the full cost is about $400,000. And the young Black farmer has done a GoFundMe page and has raised enough money for about a quarter of that, but not for all of it. And this has been a GoFundMe process alive for about 8 months now, maybe a little bit longer. So that farmer came to me and said, Sam, is it possible that the agrarian commons would support a hybrid model where you guys get my aunt's land and you put it in the commons, but 7 years from now, I buy it outright with my cooperators, because I have 3 other families that are going to move on to this land with me, and we're gonna grow food here and do other things together. Now, my own answer to her is yes, let's figure that out. But the agrarian commons answer to her is the agrarian commons wants to keep the land in the commons permanently and isn't interested in a hybrid model where you can buy it out or then maybe sell it back in as situations may change given economics. So we're creating a hybrid which allows us, outside of the Agrarian Commons Agrarian Trust Partnership through the Commons Innovation Fund that we're organizing, to support that possibility. So we can land bank, and then we can support farmers in over 1 year, 2 years, 8 years, however long it might be, help them put together their more fully fleshed out business model, help them begin to incubate different markets they want to access, get into those markets, check their revenue streams and their creativity around finance. And then once we have a sense that they're ready to take off and they no longer need incubation, to then sell that land into that family or that cooperative or into that trust on a culturally determined basis. So we're looking at designing for that flexibility, because we really think if we accept the notion that we all do better when we all do better, but that we're not all the same, we have to take up an approach to the future of agriculture that honors both our differences and our similarities. And that nexus of paying attention to the differences and similarities with love and with wisdom and with relation is what we believe the path to a healthier convivial future that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but also increases conviviality and honors the objectives going back to the Haitian Revolution of 1793 of abolishing all forms of domination, power, and control, and saying we have to be mutual if we're all relatives. So let's be good with each other in all the ways we need to be good with each other so that the land is good, the people are good, and the future looks bright. So I'll stop there and I'll go back and dig into the questions unless somebody else wants to just sort of, raise your hand and pop out a question out loud. Kevin is asking urban farmers to sequester soil carbon realistic. Great question. Kevin, you want to come off mute and say it out loud? I don't want to have to speak for you, so you can speak for yourself.
Sure. Yeah, just the question is for urban farms. This is a Chicago-based group, and I'm looking into this, something I want to learn more about, but understanding the processes of carbon and maybe the trade-offs that could exist specifically in small scale areas where people are really trying to produce as much as they possibly can, but also acknowledging that the more we extract, that's also pulling carbon at the same time. So sort of an interesting trade-off there.
I love your question. And instead of thinking about trade-offs, I want to encourage us to think about reciprocities. And so, yes, for an urban farmer to actually make their living with production, they have to, be pretty innovative. But instead of each farmer thinking about their carbon footprint, it's important to think about urban food sheds. And on an urban food shed basis, how does the urban food shed think about the tree canopy and agroforestry and continuous living cover, or what folks in the European Union call continuously productive urban landscapes that maybe feature perennials more so than annuals? You've always got something coming into the root structure, which allows you to keep water in the landscape, allows you to reduce the heat island effect, allows you to improve air quality, which also reduces the environmental justice overburden in poor urban communities, and allows you to have a more long-term viable urban food production system, because you have an urban food production system that is not extracting the wealth of the soil or the wealth of the water base, which agriculture depends on. So you can flood-proof and drought-proof your agriculture, not entirely, but somewhat, by thinking at the food shed level and inviting and supporting farmers in learning how to think about participatory watershed governance and participatory food shed governance. We have in the United States of America the most vulgar individualist cosmology of any place I've ever been. And regardless of the kind of body we walk around in, we've internalized that. And I think part of our challenge is to recognize that alone, I can't solve climate crisis. I can't solve the flood and drought conditions that are showing their face increasingly in the urban environment in Chicago and also in Minneapolis, where I am. But we can design a collective solution that allows me to grow food productively here without a tree canopy, because there's a place over here where we're restoring the tree canopy. So thinking about it intersectionally and relationally on a broader regional basis allows us to support higher productivity of farmers while also supporting higher productivity in other places in terms of carbon sequestering capacity. So that's my quick response, Kevin, to your really important questions. And I'll tell one quick story to go along with it. In 2011, we had a tornado that came through North Minneapolis. It destroyed 6,000 trees. It just so happened that 2011 is when we began to really upscale our urban agriculture movement. So as we began to talk about what do we do about the loss of all the trees, we had a lot of farmers say to us, you know what, I don't want to replace that tree canopy because now we have more land available for growing food. I think it's a mistake to not think about the tree canopy and food production landscapes in the same breath. I think we have to think about them together. And I also accept and acknowledge that it's more of a challenge than I would like to get people to think about them together. So in order to foster that kind of thinking, I organized sustainable food labs for the community as a whole, with the hope that it would support our farmers, our policymakers, our people who are really committed to ecological integrity in the region, to really think more wisely together about growing a future that has ecological integrity, economic possibility, cultural integrity, and democratic livability, all kind of, wired together. Didn't get as far as I would have liked over the 3 years of doing those food labs. The struggle is real. It's an ongoing evolutionary process. But I really think that the question is right on. So now, Kevin, I'll stop there and look at the question from Chicago Food Policy Council. So transfer of public lands, so the repasting the question about public lands. Do you know of any work being done in Minnesota or beyond around transition of public-owned agricultural lands by land grant universities, the DNR, et cetera? We're in dialogue with land grant institutions and also with churches who own a lot of land in Minnesota about partnering with us to donate that land into the commons or into some of these smaller scale trusts that are being formed on a cultural basis. We've hired an intern to work with us for this spring semester who is working with one of our colleagues at the Land Stewardship Project specifically to begin to do that kind of land banking possibilities in the rural areas of Minnesota. And the Twin Cities Agricultural Land Trust is doing that same thing in the urban environment. And we're in dialogue with the Nature Conservancy and the Trust for Public Land about ways we can partner with them in this equation as well. But this is a new part of the conversation. I don't have any positive fruits that have grown as a result of it. But one thing is true right now that wasn't true before. Following the George Floyd uprising in May of 2020, we began to see people say enough. We are going to join with you in solidarity now for the rest of our lives around these questions of how we share the planet, because no one anywhere on the earth ought to have their breath taken away by an ambassador of a system of structural violence. And we're recognizing that that system of structural violence is bigger than just the question of abolition of police community relations, but it's also an abolition of the privatization of the means of life. So we have to counter the commodification of all life and bring what's required for the well-being of the land and the well-being of the people back into a commons-based construct, which doesn't mean that there's no freedom and opportunity for us to have some kind of an ownership stake. But that ownership stake has to have some level of responsibility and integrity wired to core value commitments that honor that the land is going to be all right, that the people on that land are going to be all right, and that whatever happens on that land is not going to degrade possible futures for the people or that land in future generations. So a lot of people are talking about this groovy idea of the circular economy. One of the challenges I'd really like for you all to think about with me, not today, but in ongoing dialogues, is how do we bring the circular economy alive through small-scale agroecology? And think about, like the Chicago Food Policy Council, how are you supporting more farmers and getting onto the land with long-term tenure? How are you convincing and supporting those farmers in growing things that are the most demanded items by local cultural communities? And how do you organize that nexus of local cultural communities and farmers to make sure that people have the dense nutrition that they need and the farmer has the income they need so that both are sustaining? So it's a reciprocal sustainability, organizing for that. Instead of people who are wasting 40% of the food that comes into the house, throwing it away, all of that potential food waste is compost, directly going into the local economy. So we're building wealth by keeping everything in the system and not letting anything out of the system. But in order to keep everything in the system, we have to take a responsibility together to cut out all forms of toxicity that are wired into our choices about food now. So we have to move away from processed, plastic-covered food towards local food, which requires refrigeration or eating it sooner or freezing it and canning it. So there's a lot of different levels to this. So I'd encourage the folks in the Food Policy Council, and you might already be doing this, to do what we're doing and just to do regular design hacks where you get a diversity of people into the process with each other. And we just keep on figuring and figuring and figuring, relating, innovating, democratizing, healing, and then just growing this infrastructure of conviviality. And the future is bright if we stay focused, not on the distractions, but stay focused on the vision and the values and the relationships. So we're getting close to time. So I'm going to call on some help from folks who are monitoring the chat to help me make sure I'm catching stuff. Anything you all are noticing in the chat that I am not catching that you want to call out?
There was one question earlier, Sam, around that came in on the Whova platform around just how it came to be that the state owns so much land in the first place. And then, yeah, if anyone has any other final kind of questions to close this out, looks like we have a little bit more time to kind of get to one more. I'll just make a plug for folks also about filling out our session survey. And I'll just put that in the chat while we're talking about this.
So one thing that I feel like I need to call in is the negative historical pattern of our land grant institutions. So our land grant institutions source from a cosmology of expertise. And when they come into community, they're disrespectful. And I think they're blind to how disrespectful they are. So I've made the mistake of inviting a whole lot of really smart cats that I work with closely at the University of Minnesota, as an example. And then folks in my community said, don't bring them back here, Sam, because this is what they did in my small circle, and this is what they did in my small circle. This is one of these things, right? If you're in a black body, you do twice the work for half the value, right? So any statistic you look at, what's our home ownership rate? It's half, even though we might have got in at the same kind of, with the same amount of equity up front or the same amount of collateral up front. What's our income compared to our education? What is our family wealth compared to our neighbor down the street who might be in a white body? What is our land ownership rate compared to other people who have the same kind of asset class in terms of the amount of education they have, the same kind of income they have? Anywhere you look, you're going to see this pattern of racialization of benefits. Our land grant institutions have not yet learned to be the level of a transformative resource that we're asking them to be. But they'll never figure it out if we just say, y'all stay over there in your lane. We're just going to do our thing over here. Part of our work has to be to continue to heal and to continue to ask the tough questions, and to ask the tough questions to the best of our ability in a way that both gives empathy to the way they're limited right now, but also gives excitement to the ways in which there's a win-win scenario in the future if they begin to come down to our level and think with us, think this through with us, and stop trying to be the expert. So there's an opportunity for our land grant institutions and our faith-based institutions and our branches of government to move in the right direction. I had a dialogue with a good friend of mine who is organizing with the Native nations in Alaska. And he's a Native lawyer, and he has written the Constitution for the Yupik Nation and designed for the state of Alaska their co-management paradigm for how Native nations and the government of Alaska share responsibility for the integrity of natural resources in that state. So I said, I'm in these dialogues now with the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund in Minnesota. I'm trying to understand how to help all of these folks who are sort of stuck on feeling like we're in a tough moment and we have to fight like hell to defend natural resource integrity. And now I'm coming in and saying natural resource integrity has to center environmental justice. And they're saying, we think that's a great idea. Can it wait? And I'm saying, no, it can't wait. Environmental justice has to be now. And then their second question is, how can we think about environmental justice with you that includes poor white farmers who are being significantly drained of soil health, of local water quality, while they have an increasing debt burden and they have increasing water pollution and increasing cancer, in their bodies and in their regions, while the economy is being hollowed out in these rural areas? Can we talk about environmental justice in a way that is intersectional across cultures and doesn't divide Blacks, Indigenous people from white people in these poor rural communities? And our answer to that is hell yes. We have to organize on that intercultural basis because we're in this together. So in all the ways that we carry this work forward, we have to honor what is the song, what is the dream, what are the fears, where are the blocks to trust and relationship in each cultural community, and where are the opportunities to use an intercultural frame for healing justice that actually allows us to build one common narrative that allows us to create a different hope horizon for the future that centers environmental and climate justice in the way we think about natural resources, including soil health in agriculture. So I'm now doing a 3-month campaign with a whole bunch of BIPOC environmental justice organizers in Minnesota to look at the framing of our lottery amendment, which puts money into natural resources, and making an argument by May of this year, or by June of this year, that says, here's a way to do the investments in natural resource integrity that also cleans up the environmental justice overburden in our BIPOC communities and our poor rural white communities over the next generation. So it's that kind of design work that's tangible and concrete that allows us to build new necessary allies where before those divides have seemed intractable. So anyway, the work continues. But I'll stop there and I'll yield back to my friends at the Chicago Food Policy Council to close us out.
Sam, thank you so much. I am just really leaving this session with so many new ideas and new knowledge, and I just feel so grateful for the time that you've spent with us this afternoon. And I do want to share that we will have a recording available of this presentation so that folks who couldn't make it today can watch it. That will be on our YouTube channel, and we'll make sure that every registered attendee gets the link. So just again, really grateful for your time. Thank you everyone who has joined us for this session. I just put another plug in the chat. Please click on the rate session button in Whova to share your thoughts. And we do have an overall summit survey that's available as well if you want to share how your day today has been going overall. And Michelle just posted, don't forget the flavor and reimagination pairing curated by organizers and volunteers to continue doing the work and leaning in, learning after this session. And yeah, the conversation continues. So join us on the Whova platform for more discussion. And I think with that, we will come to a close. Have a great rest of the afternoon, y'all.
Take care, everybody.